1/3 of all annual giving occurs in December. As trust and estate professionals, we are well aware of the tax reasons for December's donation popularity, but the end of the year also coincides with faith-based giving. How does a person's religion impact their giving? Today, ACTEC Fellows offer professionals an overview of giving traditions in Christianity, Judaism, and Islamic faiths. Moderator Amy Beller discusses tithing, zakat, religious traditions, and more with Ray Odom and Jonathan Raccoon.
As we approach the holiday season, we anticipate not only spending time with family and friends, but also sharing with others by means of giving. Religious traditions of giving to others endure because they remind us in a tangible way to look beyond ourselves. Giving helps us to recognize the power that each of us has to make the world a better place. Different religious traditions may use varying terms for giving: philanthropy, charity, tzedakah, or zakat. Some faith traditions view gifting as an expression of love, and others as fulfillment of an obligation. We decided on this presentation for the month of December because of the convergence of holidays at this time of year, including, of course, Christmas, Kwanzaa, and Hanukkah, and also the Buddhist holiday of Rohatsu, the Islamic holiday of Mawlid el-Nabi, Solstice, which is a Wiccan holiday, Boxing Day in the UK, and Omisoka in Japan. A 2011 paper entitled Diversity and Donations: The Effect of Religious and Ethnic Diversity on Charitable Giving was published by the National Bureau of Economic Research. The authors took a deep dive into this topic, using carefully collected data to support conclusions about giving rates among different ethnic and religious populations. In our estate and trust practices, we may not always consider how religion impacts giving and lifetime gifting decisions, and how counseling our clients should take cultural and religious norms and practices into consideration. The purposes of this presentation is to touch upon these issues so that we are mindful of how these issues impact our practices and our clients. Ray, would you please tell us about the traditions of giving in Christianity?
Thank you, Amy. Yes, I will. But before I go there, I'd like to try and encourage our listeners to really embrace and really celebrate the diversity represented by religious practices. My normal practice is to try to encourage year-end giving by talking about tax provisions and tax policy and tax benefits. I think that's a weak motivation, especially as we see Congress do lots of different things with tax policy and not be nearly as predictable as they used to be. For me, I believe the key is to understand that of all the charitable giving that's done, 28% is given for religious purposes. That is 2 times the secondary amount given to education, which is at 14 or 15%. And so the key for me is understanding that any client who might represent themselves as being Christian has an intention of giving that can be, so to speak, teased out, profiled, encouraged, that will take them into areas that will give me a better opportunity to plan and them a better opportunity to give. And that's especially true in an environment where rates of childbirth and grandchildren have declined, and we see lots of changes in the 1950s traditional family. Well, on to what Christianity would say about this. First and foremost, understanding that Christianity deals with Christ. And as followers of Jesus the Christ, the first thing we have to understand is he was very Jewish. And so his practice of giving would have been embedded in the Jewish practices that Jonathan will be discussing later. But most importantly is the fact that Christians all celebrate, even at this time, the fact that Jesus was born into poverty and lived a life that really eschewed the kinds of wealth and other things that many of us take for granted. That point is made only for the purpose of trying to set up the concepts of what charity and giving mean in the Christian context. First and foremost is the idea of the love of God. Levitical law talks about loving God as the preeminent command. And from that, Christ connected the desire or the command to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, there you have it. This concept of love fully embraced and embedded in the concept of charity. So where do we go with that? Well, the key is to understand the concept of philanthropy. Many of you use that term all the time. And when I think of philanthropy, I a lot of times think about museums and hospital wings and other things, but I miss the key understanding of the word, which is really a Greek word that's philos and anthropos, which means the first, sibling love, brotherly love, the city of Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, philos and anthropos, humankind, the love of humankind. So embedded in our very secular term, philanthropy is the concept of love. It's right there. And so to do philanthropy is really to be trying to demonstrate a love of humankind. Well, that perfectly dovetails with the Christian concept, because the love of our neighbor is illustrated by Christ in his early teachings. As he's talking with those who would listen to him, he says, they, of course, ask the obvious question, well, who is my neighbor? And then he gives the story that we refer to as the Good Samaritan story, which literally talks about a person who was very marginalized in that culture. Yes, Samaritans were not racially and ethnically and socially someone that Jesus, as a Jewish person, would have necessarily been hanging out with. So the reality is that what he does is he sets a standard that says you should be very concerned with those who have some misfortune, some of those who are marginalized in that culture or in that society, and those who have a need. And of course, the person that the Good Samaritan is helping, we all realize was someone who was beaten up, robbed, and left to die. And so this really sets up the whole notion of giving. Now, of course, embedded in that notion is the idea of giving to the church, your regular tithes, offerings, and then ultimately it is about love. In the most sacred Christian ritual, which is Eucharist or communion, the sacrament, where you're celebrating the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ as atonement and forgiveness of all of our wrongdoing. After that ceremony is celebrated in virtually all Christian denominations and sects, etc., there is a time for benevolence. And that's the key word that I wanted to leave with you. It is that concept of doing good. You see, the concept is love, philanthropy, love of humankind. Then from there, we go to this concept of charity. And charity actually, in the King James translation of the Bible, is the word love. It's interesting because in marriages, Christian marriages, you'll often hear the officiant talk about 1 Corinthians 13, Apostle Paul's celebration of this concept of love. And of course, it's a romantic situation. And so you're waiting for the translation to say, but the greatest of these is love. But that's not really what the King James says. It says the greatest of these is charity, because in the King James, they didn't have a good word. And in English, we only have one word for love. And so they didn't know what to do. So they used the word charity. The point being that it's so clearly associated with love. And then benevolence, of course, means doing good, willing good, bene, good, volition, will. And so the reality is that after this Christian ritual of communion, celebrating communion, community, common union, and after that, the thing that's done is to gather a benevolence offering. The idea is that it will be an offering that takes care of those who are poor, those who are in the situation that perhaps the Good Samaritan story so illustrates so well. And so that really is a brief overview of how I think we get to the giving that is particularly and uniquely Christian. And with that, Amy, we'll go on.
Thank you, Ray. Jonathan, what about giving traditions in the Jewish religion?
first, Ray, thank you for your exposition. And I can reinforce your description of Jesus as having Jewish roots because you quoted him as having said, love your neighbor as yourself, which is, of course, is him quoting Leviticus, which uses a perfectly good Hebrew word for love, which we still have today, ahava. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha means you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Who is reacha, your neighbor in Judaism? That is the term generally used for your fellow resident, your fellow congregant, your fellow inhabitant. It excludes the foreigner who is a threat, but it does not literally mean your next door neighbor. And sometimes it's translated as friend, but it doesn't really mean friend. It is much broader than that. Anyway, back to our main story. What about giving in Judaism? It's not calendar related in the same way that you might think about, oh, end of year, we have to make gifts. There are tax motivations for that, of course. There are holidays associated with giving. Hanukkah a little bit in recent centuries. Much earlier than that, Purim, which falls in March, where the book of Esther describes the practice of giving to neighbors and friends. And there is a little bit of a differentiation there between neighbors and friends. And of course, since law plays a heavy role in traditional Judaism, there's a description of what you include and how much you include and when you give it and what counts and what doesn't count. So that we have that. But uncorrelated to the calendar, there is the concept of tithing. The tithing is, first of all, to whom does one tithe? Well, that's pretty broad, and we'll see that includes poor individuals, charitable institutions, and organizations that provide benefits to the society at large. The first example that we have of tithing is Abraham, obviously the progenitor of the three Abrahamic religions, which we're discussing today. And Abraham in chapter 14 of Genesis just won a remarkable victory over the superpower of this time, the four kings who had aligned themselves and conquered essentially the entire Middle East. He went and rescued his nephew Lot, who had been kidnapped from Sodom, where he was residing. Very bad choice of neighbors. And Abraham was greeted by the local priest, and we'll come back at the end and say who this priest was. And Abraham said, I'm giving 10% of the war booty, and this was a novel innovation apparently at the time, to the priest to be used for religious purposes. So that's the first tithing, I think. His grandson Jacob, the forerunner of the Jewish people, adopted the practice of tithing a few chapters later in the book of Genesis. And by the time we get to the Mosaic books of Leviticus and Numbers, we have the concept of 10% tithe institutionalized as an agricultural obligation with lots of details about how much and when and to whom and how that's calculated. We no longer live in an agrarian society, but Jewish practice continues to emphasize tithing as, at the very least, a benchmark. And it covers 10% of essentially net revenue. There are various ways of calculating it. It's usually calculated before the end of the year, which of course, surprise, surprise, is Rosh Hashanah in September, not December, New Year's. But it takes place throughout the course of the year. And it does include individuals, qualified charitable organizations. Doesn't make any difference for these purposes, whether you need to worry about the gift tax exemption or the charitable deduction. All of the above qualify for tithing. How do we know the details of what's best to tithe? Well, we have as a guidance the 12th century writings of Maimonides, a towering figure, a medieval Jewish philosophy and law, who also had a great influence in the Muslim world. And he gives us a tiered hierarchy of giving. The best is to assist a poor person to earn a living, whether through an interest-free loan, an investment partnership, a gift to finance a business venture, or helping to find employment. And by the way, those familiar with the 19th century New York poverty law will be thinking of the HIAS, the Hebrew Free Loan Society, which helped many immigrants with interest-free loans. The other charitable tiers are to individuals. in the Maimonidean construct that was really before large charitable institutions other than synagogues and schools. And the more favored are more anonymous and more generous and more enthusiastic, and the less favored have the opposite characteristics. There is a due diligence obligation, whether the donee is an individual or an organization, to make sure that there is no fleecing of the donor and that the uses are suitable. What's the philosophy behind all of this? And this comes through in many sources. And the philosophy, which is really critical when we're dealing with our clients and their charitable goals. We, human beings, our clients as wealthy human beings, are temporary custodians of wealth. And it comes to us in this view, not only, or maybe not even, due to our own efforts and our own brilliance, but at least in large part through divine assistance. And that's part of a heavenly plan which provides the wealthy with wealth so that they can help the needy, whether it's on an individual basis to family members, friends, neighbors, larger society, or contributing to universities, hospitals, museums, schools, synagogues, other houses of worship. All of that is what we're supposed to do as custodians of wealth. Now, I mentioned Abraham's original tithing, and it sounds like that might have been just a gift to a priest in gratitude for something or other. It is traditionally known by the name of this priest. His name was Melchizedek, which means my king is righteous. So the priest, who was also a king, there were lots of kings in those days, so he was a king, but his king, the king of kings, was the righteous one, Tzedek. And Tzedek is the root of the word tzedakah, which is translated as charity, but really means we're doing the right thing when we support those who are less fortunate than us in one of these ways. And so we go all the way back, charity linked up to tzedakah. It shows up in the Muslim word, as we're going to hear in a few minutes, and in some of those practices. But I think it all does root from Abraham and the successive development of these concepts in Judaism.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ray, I think you know something about the giving traditions in Islam. Would you please share that with us?
Thank you. Well, I came to understand and try to understand giving in Islam for the same reasons that I feel this video was so important. And that is because I had a client who was Muslim, and he asked me to give him some planning advice regarding his obligation of zakat. And of course, not only did I have trouble pronouncing it, but I had trouble trying to figure out exactly what was required. Obviously, being an Abrahamic faith, I thought maybe this was a tithe, and that wasn't quite right. And so what I was able to find out is that zakat really is an imperative command that's embedded throughout the Quran. And it is embedded as an indicator of the righteousness of God and the righteousness and compliance of the person who is serving God. The reality is zakat actually comes out to be about 2.5% of wealth. It's not necessarily limited to income. And as a result, for someone, as my client was, who had a sale for like 30 million or so, that it was an important amount of money to try and discuss. And the key in zakat really is there's a priority of giving, similar to what Jonathan had mentioned in his discussions. And the priority in zakat is really to start with the poor, and the poor is defined. They have clear definitions of who qualifies and who does not. And then there's the needy. The needy are different from the poor. In addition to the needy, there are those who are in slavery or who are being oppressed. There's also those who are in debt, and those who are in immigration or that are in transition. And these things are very important. And again, I think the concept in Islam is that Allah has given us all that we have. And one of the key concepts that I found quite enlightening is when speaking of Allah, one of the key words that's used is the word beneficent, beneficent. And of course, that ties to the earlier comment I had made about the word benevolence. It's this idea of doing good. And of course, God is all good and he does good to us. And so really, I thought one of the best ways maybe to give you an idea of this is to actually read from a paraphrase of the Quran. I'm going to read to you actually has the Quran. To be the Quran, it has to be in Arabic. And so what I'm reading to you is a paraphrase of the Arabic. But I think it gives a sense of what is required and the idea. And so it says here, indeed, in God we are hopeful. Indeed, prescribed charitable offerings are only to be given to the poor and the indigent, and to those who work on administering it, and to those whose hearts are to be reconciled, and to free those in bondage, and to the debt-ridden, and for the cause of God, and to the wayfarer. This is an obligation from God, and God is all-knowing and all-wise. This is from Surah 9:60. And I think that sums up really the ideas and the basis of zakat and how it's to be given, and in a sense, why. And I think this gives us a tremendous opportunity as practitioners to shape and suggest and help our clients to do more than just do their annual giving based on some tax law, and actually begin to embrace that part of all of us that is really essential to our humanity.
Thank you, Ray. The few minutes we've had with you is barely enough to scratch the surface of this fascinating topic. And of course, there are a vast number of religions in the world that we haven't even mentioned. Our hope is that this brief discussion is a catalyst for all of us to think about faith-based giving traditions and norms, and how gift planning may be impacted, and most importantly, to be aware that these topics should be discussed with our clients. Thank you for your attention.
That was informative to me and will help me understand the differences and similarities in religion-based giving. There's another video in this series, Giving from the Heart, that discusses philanthropy, estate planning, and donating with diversity and equality in mind. Take time to educate yourself about end-of-the-year gifting in different cultural and religious traditions so you can better serve your clients' needs. Please visit ACTEC, actec.org/diversity for resources on this topic, and also to subscribe to ACTEC's YouTube channel to be informed of new videos as they become available.